folks. You're listening to the Idea Roastery. I'm Herman.
And I'm Jason.
So, Jason, you've been working on a couple of little side projects over the last few weeks. How's that going for you?
I have been working on some side projects. It's been going good. So for those who don't know or haven't, I think maybe picked it up, I recently quit my job. I wasn't laid off. I quit on my own accord.
Just clarifying over
Yeah,
there.
just to clarify, because I mean, I was working for a big company and spending a lot of time making podcasts. But no, from the 1st of July, basically, I was a free person out in the world, open to do my own thing. It was quite a jump, I guess, but it's something that I've been planning for a long time. And once I, got over the first few weeks of essentially chilling, as one would do, you kind of move from. If you've ever been on on a holiday from work, you kind of get the same feeling those first few weeks. It's just like you feel like, oh, I'm just on holiday. There's like a kind of niggling that you might go back. On Sundays, you still have a little bit of anxiety because you think like, oh, like what's going to be happening the next week. But that kind of subsided a little bit. Although there's still like Sunday anxiety, I still get that. But I was able to start doing my own thing. And my original plan, coming out of working at AWS, was to do consulting. I think there's a lot of people that I've seen who go from just working to consulting because it's something easy. I had this idea of like consulting and then eventually making products because when speaking to a couple of people on this topic, they said, yeah, consulting is cool, but you actually have to manage a lot of people. And me being more of an introvert, I kind of wasn't quite keen on that. And so I thought about it and thought, instead of just like creating a consulting company to create products, why don't I just start creating some products first, right? Rather, there's like this saying, like, everyone tries to do everything except the thing that they should be doing. And so I thought, why not just give that a go? I've done a lot of sort of small side projects in the past, but nothing that's really been like published. I guess I've got a very good interest in programming languages. I've played around with a couple of them, but there's been one or two projects that I've been creating recently within the, I'd say, DevOps space, because it's something that I'm quite interested in. I'm very interested in automation. The first one is the one that I'm working on sort of more recently. Is basically there's these things called self-hosted runners. It's like part of like GitHub, GitLab, these kind of platforms. But I noticed there's a challenge when trying to run these runners in your own environment. And so the first tool is kind of like a kind of DevOpsy tool where you can just connect it up to your GitHub and then you run runners, but you don't have to sort of configure it yourself. So that's the first one. And then there's a couple of other ones that I've been sort of working on. One of them is just like an uptime monitor. But yeah, they're progressing slowly. And I guess you yourself, Herman, have gone through this at some point in your life, right? Because you've got two successful, I'd say. I think it is two at the moment, or maybe more. What I wanted to talk about today is just like, what's the guidance that you have, and what are the kind of things I should try and avoid?
See it all condensed into one podcast.
I mean, the first one I know for sure is like the marketing side, right? There's a lot of people that say, don't build anything until you've actually validated the idea, which I've completely ignored.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's gonna bite me in the ass.
It might bite you in the ass a little bit, depends on how much you've built. So I like to think of product developments. For a bit of background, I run a blogging platform called Bear Blog, as well as a 3D modeling tool for artists called Just Sketch Me. I also have significantly more failed projects than that. I also sold a journaling tool previously. I like to think about product design and development in three phases. The first one is the ideation phase, and then that kind of works into the second phase, which is the validation phase. And then the third phase is, the whole building and iterating, which there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of overlap between these different phases. Learning how to find friction in your life or in your business is a very valuable skill to have. I think a lot of people just go about their lives and the friction that they experience during their life, they just don't even think about that. That's just the way that something is. But someone who is primed to look for ideas realizes that, oh, this is actually not ideal and it can be improved. Especially in programming. I mean, there's I remember when I was doing game dev where, the build time was 15 minutes compiling all the assets and everything. And like no one was even no one even thought about cutting down the build times. They're just like, hey, when you press build, it's 15 minutes, go make yourself a cup of coffee and everything. And like that's nice. But if you build 5 times a day, let's call it 6 times a day for easy math, like that's hour and a half of the workday that's spent every day just building. So like
Yeah.
becoming primed for seeing those friction points and then keeping track of them. So I personally actually have a Trello board called Ideas with a Z, and it's
Yeah.
full. Actually, let me pull it open over here just so you can hear. It's
So
also like full of a lot of bullshit.
so maybe for the listeners, I guess, the first one that came was just Sketch Me, right? But if I remember correctly, that had, obviously it has some similarities to game dev, which you've done in the past, right? But
Yeah.
what it was, it just like an idea that you thought, oh, let's just create this thing? Because if I remember correctly, it was kind of something that you just threw up on
Yeah.
the internet, and you were like showing me one day in a coffee shop. They're like, hey, look at this thing that me and Simon built. Um, and then you kind of like went off it, and you like sort of almost forgot about it. But then you came back, and there, like, did you notice that there were people like using it,
Yeah,
or?
that's exactly it. We actually had a little donate button on the site, and I kind of like left it on the back burner for about a year. And one day I received an email saying that someone had donated $40. I'm like, huh. Went and checked out the analytics, and there were 40, 50 people using the tool per day. Now, inadvertently, what I'd done over there is I'd stepped into the validation step.
Mm.
I'd gone to see whether there was space in the market for a tool like that. I did it accidentally by just putting it up there, making a post on Reddit and forgetting about it for a year. Turns out a year is a good amount of time to validate an idea. There are many ways to be a lot more intentional about it. But I've done this with a bunch of other things before and since. Most recently, I wrote a small web app that just calculates the opportunity cost of renting versus buying your house. I wrote a AI WhatsApp chatbot builder that we launched about a year ago to medium success. Um, I've got a bunch of things that I like to play around with. But let's talk about the validation step, because the validation step is actually a really interesting one. There's there are before actually writing code generally, we need to figure out what the smallest amount of effort route is to validate something before putting in too much effort. So let's take, for instance, back in 2016, I wanted to build a ride sharing platform that took people between cities um, and to festivals and back. And this, you would like put up a post saying, I am driving from Cape Town to Durban on the 28th of August. I have 2 seats available in my car. I'm going to charge 800 Rand a person. And then people can take that instead of taking a bus or taking flights or something like that. And so, and this is the first mistake that I have seen time and time again with everyone who is new to creating product. They just jump and they start building the thing, right? Um, Now the first thing that you actually need to do is to check whether there is appetite uh for this kind of tool. So there's actually a really great book on this process called the mom test, where it is used to validate ideas while removing the ego from it, while removing yourself from it. And the reason it's called the mom test, let me explain it with an example in the book. If you have an idea, an application that recipes, recipe book on your phone. You can create your own recipes. You can share your recipes with friends. You can find new recipes, etc., etc. You go to your mom and you say, "Hey, mom, I'm going to build an app that is a recipe book on your phone. You can share recipes with your friends, uh, find new recipes, etc., etc." She'll say, "Wow, that's actually a really good idea," and she'll believe it, right? That's because she's not critically examining the idea for what it's worth. She doesn't even necessarily have the tools to examine that idea for what it's worth. Instead, what she's doing is she's thinking, Jason is smart, and therefore this is a good idea. A much more robust way to measure whether this is a good idea is to go to your mom and say, "Hi, I see you've got 5 recipe books in the kitchen. Where did you get them?" And she'll say, "Oh, I got those 2 at an airport when I was waiting for a flight once because the pictures were pretty, but I haven't actually cooked anything out of them. And then the other 3 were gifts. I think I've made the tiramisu on that one over there, and I've used the other one for that lasagna that we have every now and then. But that's pretty much it." And then I say, like, "Well, how do you generally get your recipes?" And she says, "Oh, I get ChatGPT to generate them, or I search them on the internet and I skip all the SEO text, go down to the bottom, find the recipe and do it from there." And so then
Yeah.
I say, "Okay, well, have you ever considered downloading an app? Because there are many apps on the App Store that have huge libraries of recipes." She's like, like I've never actually downloaded an app or even thought to look for an app for that. I just Google the recipe that I want to find and I look through the websites.
Mm.
And so essentially what you've done over there is you've asked the same question, is this app a good idea? But with very, very different answers. And the second, the latter is the more accurate answer. It's the more honest answer because you've taken
Mm.
yourself out of the equation. You haven't said validate me. You said, do you
Mm.
use do you use these tools in the ways that I expect you to use these tools? Right. So that's the first
Yeah.
stage of validation. Now, if you've gotten past that stage and you think that there is a market for this, that people would reasonably use a tool like that, the the next step is to figure out how you can test that assumption in the real world. So if I go back to my my failed ride sharing platform, right? Let's say for instance I had asked people, say like, "Hey, you know, have you would you sit in a car with a stranger to go to another city, assuming that there was verification?" And they said yes, and I went through that whole shebang. So then there's the temptation to just start writing the code, build out the platform. But writing code is very expensive, both in terms of time and effort. And if you're paying someone to do the programming money, um, the easiest way to validate that idea would have been to start a Facebook group, right, called Rideshare, and then have people create Facebook posts saying, "I'm traveling from here to here," right? Be the moderator of that group, spread the word of that group around. If this group becomes well used and there's, you know, tens of rides per day happening on it, then that idea is validated. It's like, okay, cool. Now let's create a platform that incorporates payments and everything to make it more secure, as well as some personal safety things like reviews, et cetera, et cetera. So over there, you've validated the idea because people obviously want to use this in the way that you understood it, right? And so you start building out the platform. Now, that brings us into the final stage over there is that we never have the idea fully formed before like everything changes when it connects with reality. I forget what the exact quote is, but
Yeah.
if you think that this is the way that a thing needs to be solved and you start building for it, you'll realize that actually there are better ways to solve it once more information has been gained because you're unsure of all the, you know, unknown unknowns. Um, and so in a nutshell, that's kind of like a simple validation process to get your foot in the door to actually build the thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot that that you've expelled there. So yeah, it's I guess in the early phases, from what you've said, is it's like there's questions that you need to be on that need to be answered, and every time you're kind of running these experiments and testing your hypothesis and getting some sort of like response, and that's basically validation, right? So you're validating ideas along the way. But what I really liked about what you said is the kind of process that you have, right? So you have like a passion for development, and what you do is you actually deploy things, right? You ship things, and I think what maybe people don't necessarily think about as much is the time that goes into those things. So first of all, the actual development does take time, but also just getting it deployed and somewhere, right? Because if you didn't deploy just Sketch Me as like a little sort of toy like experiment, like no one would have clicked on that button, and no one would have donated it. But it's kind of like, you know, using your passion and driving that passion to actually just put something out there. There is obviously the sort of challenge with that, is that you do need to be somewhat smart in the way that you do it, because you do want to keep the costs down, right? Because like if your thing is costing you like $1,000 a month, you're not gonna be able to have that thing running for like, you know, a couple of years or the time that it takes to validate.
I'm sure you've heard the term premature optimization, right?
Exactly. So being very like scrappy and being sort of like, which is what you were saying in terms of the validation, right? Rather than building a site and a whole like back end system and like 3 tiers and 8 analytics, just do like a WhatsApp group, right? Or
You want to
just
hear something
leverage
crazy?
what's existing.
Is Just Sketch Me for the first 2 years of its existence was deployed on GitHub Pages, which is a free web hosting that links up to your GitHub profile. It was deployed on
Yeah.
GitHub Pages for free. And then when I first decided to start monetizing, I it didn't have a backend at all. It was just a static site. So I wanted to add the minimum possible as the backend. So I said, okay, people can save their poses, but I didn't want to spin up everything. So I just used a Google Sheet as the database. And so they would purchase a license off of Gumroad, and then they could save their pose, and it would save it under their license key on the Google Sheet. And after the first day that I released this first paid feature, 2 people signed up for $5 a month. And I'm like, okay, cool, there's something here. So I just carried on refining that feature a little bit. And at a certain point, the sheet became too slow because there were, 2,000 records in it. And so I switched over to using, at the time, a Firebase real-time database. But the ease of me just setting up a quick Google Sheet over there was, I mean, so easy. I actually used one of those API wrappers for Google Sheets. So it was just a REST,
Yeah.
post and get, right? It is now
Yeah.
significantly more comprehensive. It's got a Django backend that has user profiles and et cetera, et cetera, et
Mm.
cetera. But that first test was just, hey, let's see if people pay me money for this. They did pay me money for it. Awesome. Let's build out the rest of it. And
Mm.
I think that we were prior to this call talking about Peter Levels. Peter Levels, a bit of a controversial character. Whether you agree with him or disagree with him is immaterial. One thing that man knows how to do is ship the simplest thing possible. You just be like, hey, this is a single PHP file that
Yeah.
runs my, $2 million business, whatever.
Yeah.
And I really respect that about him,
Yeah.
because the fact of the matter is, to this day, just Sketch Me's infrastructure costs are only about $12 a month.
Oof, don't tell people that.
I know. Sorry, they're a bajillion dollars a month.
So I think this is a very, very valid point, and something that I've scraped along as well, is the ego question, right? So I think you had it moving from like a pretty sort of formalized software development background into this new sort of role, and I think that's probably you know, even in industry, you see people doing like optimizations and tech people really love a good tech problem, and they're like distributed systems, and this has got to be like infinitely scalable. I know in my role in the past, I multiple times get customers who say like, I want this thing to scale infinitely. I'm like, bro, you don't even have any customers, right?
You you
And
really
so
don't.
the
Like run it on a SQLite database.
what can you say about ego when it comes, and you kind of mentioned it with like pizza levels, but like ego in when you're starting up these small projects, like
Hmm.
anything about that?
Yeah, so actually, you say I come from well, I came from a fairly standard developer role, and you're correct if you're talking about right before just Sketch Me, but I originally come from a game design background. And what's interesting about game design when compared to traditional software development is that game design needs to put things in front of users immediately, right? And there's a reason for this is that if you're building financial systems tools or web apps or something like that, you're optimizing for a specific purpose, right? You're saying I'm optimizing for, let's say you're making a budgeting app. I'm optimizing for people to have more money at the end of the month than they would usually have, right? Um, Whereas with games, you're optimizing for something a lot more abstract, a lot more fuzzy. You're optimizing for fun. And so if you have an idea for a mechanic, the thing that you put down in front of your first players is just like squares and circles, or cubes and pyramids moving around. And you watch them play, and the way that they interact with the game um, tells you how to build it out because you've got this idea at the beginning. You're like, what would be really cool is if we had a platformer game that played around with time and you could switch between the past and the future. But the actual mechanic of it is, red and blue blocks. Red is the past, future is blue. And the character can jump onto red blocks when they're red, or they jump onto blue blocks when they're blue,
Mm.
right? And you can validate those ideas and then just carry on going on with that. And the thing about having those kinds of design processes is that you you nurture the ability to take this whole like I am the mastermind out of it
Mm.
and put something in front of someone and become highly um available to feedback, right? You actually want to hear what people are saying. And uh, I have seen this with young developers where they are highly critical of feedback. Someone says something like, "Hey, this isn't," and they actually get offended. And it's like, no, you need
Mm.
to put that aside. You need to like hold it at arm's length and think about the people who have something to say about it as collaborators. It's not
Mm.
them insulting you. It is you and them critically analyzing whatever it is that you're making.
And that's also customers, right? Because you might have critics in the game space, but like, if a customer tells you like, oh, I prefer it if your app did this and this, and you're like, oh, the grumpy like creator, like, oh, I don't want to do that. Like, this is not how it was intended. Then you're not going to get very far because that feedback is part of that validation process of like, you've got some idea of how the world works, and someone else comes in and says, well, I do it this way, and then you have to do this like balancing act of which one do I go with? Do I go with them? Do I stick with the vision of the product? Like, am I going to create too
Yeah.
much bloat? Is it going to be too simple? Am I going to acquire customers? And so there is kind of like this, constant sort of progression towards things, or towards a better product, right?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that you learn, sorry, there's some people riding their little tricycles up and down the street behind me
No.
having a good scream. They're having fun.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
having fun. So uh it is really a balancing act because the fact of the matter is that while a customer is never, and I'll put this in inverted commas, they're never wrong about their experience, but they are very regularly wrong about how to fix the experience,
Mm.
right? Now, they could say, I don't like this. It should be done this way. Cut out the it should be done this way and just hear the I don't like this
Mm.
and then think about how you can improve that. So I think like I do this regularly, especially with Bear, and with Just Sketch Me to a certain extent, is I get really good at saying no, especially if they're like very niche features that deviate away from the essence of the project or the ethos of the project. But I think the kings of doing this are Apple,
Mm.
right? Is any um, hardcore Android user will tell you about how many more features Android phones have and how they're superior in every way because they're infinitely customizable and you can
Mm.
sideload apps and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Apple, if you take a look at their market share, is an objectively better phone.
Mm.
Not an objectively better phone. Everyone, keep your sorry, don't crucify us. Um, but Apple makes a very opinionated uh phone and OS,
Mm.
and people really like that. Now they have made some questionable decisions. Most recently, you can like tint all of your icons on the home screen to a specific color.
What?
It's just a
Yeah.
one of the things that you can do in the latest
Mm.
update. But generally they're super minimalist in the things that they do, and they solve problems very gradually because to them the problem that they're trying to solve as their number one priority is ease of use.
Mm.
And so if you try to solve every single person's problem by default, you make an
Yeah.
incredibly complicated and hard to use
Yeah.
application. I think a good example of that is Photoshop. Photoshop is really hard to use,
Mm.
right? And it's got so many tools and it's extraordinarily powerful. But most people don't use Photoshop for digital painting anymore. They use things like Procreate that have a
Mm.
significantly reduced palette of tools. But you can combine those tools in specific ways to do the things that you need them to do. Um, Another great example is Atlassian's Jira,
Mm.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, there's memes upon memes about how difficult Jira is to use. And recently or not recently, 4 or 5 years ago, they bought Trello, which is a similar product, but Trello focuses on a incredibly limited palette and does it incredibly well. So
Mm.
I guess it also depends on
I mean,
who you're building.
yeah.
It, like
When
everything just depends.
Yeah, when you're starting, I mean, when you're starting out, I think I saw a presentation by someone, I can't remember who, but they say that there's a scale, right? Like you either have something that's really super customizable, where you need to think about all the edge cases. You maybe have like a module system. You maybe have like a way to add plugins, and it's really complicated. And maybe you're trying to like solve you manage to solve some people's problems but not everyone's problems, but it's really complicated. Or you have something that's really simple that kind of works for like a given use case, but you have people that don't like it and people don't do it, but then you still have the ability to ship because it's more simple for you as a developer, right? You're not trying to cater to all these like sort of edge cases and trying to build like this sort of monstrosity. But yeah, I mean, like the complexity, I think, is something that, as you've said, is like just try and remove it, and try if you think of a solution, just before you do that, just say, is there anything I can remove from that? Like, do I need to have a load balance service? Do I need to have like even a backend? Can I do this with Google Sheets? And I guess there is an element of you need to understand what tools are available to you. I think it's very important as someone who's in the software realm to go out and just look at these things, maybe go on Reddit a bit or go like join a WhatsApp group of friends who like show each other things, because there's a lot of tools out there. I think a lot of people use Heroku at one point because it was like cheap, but there's lots of tools that can kind of like make things easier. Like I think you mentioned it, the Google
It has
Firebase.
never been easier to host your app.
Yeah, exactly. So there's lots of tools, but it takes a little bit of smarts to kind of like choose how to connect them together. And I think, yeah, the main thing is just keeping things simple. The last thing I wanted to ask.
Before you ask that, one thing, and it depends on how technical the people listening to this are, but there's this temptation. There's a very big temptation to use no code tools for building ideas. Um, but the fact of the matter is that no code tools still require the understanding of how programming works, and they are incredibly expensive and they are incredibly slow, especially when you string them together. And this is a personal opinion. I just want to put it out there that this is my opinion. Your mileage may differ, but if you're going to program, but just by stringing a whole bunch of expensive and slow tools together, just just write some Python. ChatGPT will help you.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think like the like Django is very underrated, and I love Python and Django specifically because if you look at the history of Instagram, I think they scaled to like a couple million users just on like Django and Python. Yeah, and they were a small team.
Like Bear's doing, 50 requests a second on, one VPS.
Yeah, and it's just like simplify it and also stick to what you know. Like, don't try and like. I've also gotten into this trap where I'm trying to like sort of use esoteric languages or codes to try and do things. I think for the initial one, just like the main thing is getting it shipped. So the last thing I wanted to just sort of talk about is this idea of competition, and I think you've had it a couple of times in your past, but the idea that someone whose idea is going to get stolen and I'm not going to tell anyone about my ideas or my projects until it's like deployed and created, somewhat like myself, and I guess but that's just me knowing that I probably might switch course at some point, so I don't want to make promises. But do you have anything to say about people who compete with your products, and people that will like steal your ideas? Because I think a lot of people kind of are nervous, maybe unrightly, about if they put something up, maybe Google's going to just copy my idea and then they're going to like run me into the ground, right?
So if you have a really good idea, hey, people might steal it. They'll probably steal it. I mean, Just Sketch Me was the first mover in the pose reference space, and there are now a dozen competitors, all that look very familiar, one of which is, I would assume, a complete clone of it. I'm tempted to say that everything comes down to execution, but I think it's more accurate to say it mostly comes down to execution. I've gotten to the point now whenever I'm regularly asked by people, because I'm kind of famous in the indie hacker space. Just saying. I'm really regularly asked for people for like
Blip, blip.
little call, so that they want to tell me their idea and whatever. And I've had multiple people like send me an NDA beforehand, and I straight up say to them like, "Hey, listen, I'm
Oh
not
yeah,
signing an NDA. I'm not signing an NDA to hear your idea, because I don't say the second part. Your idea isn't that good, right? It really comes down to how you execute it. But also, I'd be limiting what I can potentially work on in the future, so that I can see your idea, which doesn't necessarily have any financial upside
yeah.
to me. So don't expect people to sign NDAs for your idea unless you're like big boy stuff.
Also, you'd be surprised how like your idea is not that new.
Yeah, no,
Like
very few new ideas.
I met hundreds of startups, and you're like, okay, so you're like a payments company, and you want to, like, are you using like Mastercard to like in the back end to create like a payments network? And okay, yeah, your idea is very unique, little crystal, like snowflake.
Yeah.
But yeah, like ideas, like everyone has ideas, like but the execution is
And
part of it.
the execution is a big part of it. And then also, like, if you have a particularly good idea, right? Like a non-obviously good idea, it's non-obvious and people are unlikely to steal it. So I think a really good example of that is Twitter. You're like 144 characters maximum. It's like a blog, but like 144 characters only. People will be like, what? Why would you do that? You can just use MySpace, where you can, customize the entire thing and write as much as you want, not be constrained to 144 characters. And so people aren't like bundling up outside the door being like, no, we're going to be the first 144 characters. It wasn't obviously a great idea at the time, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think for the vast majority of projects, the best thing you can do is that whole game design. You put it down in front of people while it's still circles and squares.
Yeah. And I think what I've come to appreciate is that although there is a lot of people copying ideas and stuff, I think people underestimate how big the internet is. And especially as like the indie hacking vibe is, I think the general consensus is to get to 5K per month, right? And if you've got like, the 1,000 true fans kind of mentality, there's millions of people on the internet. You can surely get to 1,000 users irrespective of like whether there's competition or not. I think like obviously in certain areas, it's you're not going to compete with like Google Docs, for instance, but there are certain places where there's enough people to try it and to give it a go, and you'll probably will be able to at least ship something and get one or two customers, right? And
100%.
I think it's important to keep that in mind in terms of like how many people there are. And yeah, the competition is that you've always got your vision, right? And I think people really sort of buy into the person and the process and the small business. Like a lot of people like to say, oh, I was like, you'd like user number 500 or number 2 or 3 for this really niche app that like no one really knows about. And there's also like an element of like people feeling special using like an app that no one really knows about. It's kind of like a little bit sort of dirty, but like you don't tell your friends and you say, oh, there's this cool app I've been using, it's like saving my time. And the other thing that on competition, just like the last thing to wrap it up, I guess, is if you are able to, first of all, you like, I think ship things, what I'm getting is like ship things as much as possible. But what I like is there's an idea of like, make it seem like it's hard enough that people don't copy you, right? So like make it look like from the outside that it's quite a complicated business. I don't know if I'd be able to copy that. And if you're like technical and you've come from like a software development background and you can kind of figure out how to make something like that looks technical from the outside, but is actually very simple on the inside, then that's good because it kind of acts as like a bit of a moat, right? Where people are like, yeah, I could build it, but it's, like you get like guys on the internet who's like, oh man, like I've got this idea. It's really simple. You just got to do this one thing, but then they think about it a bit more and they don't actually build it. And they like, yeah, it's a little bit too technical. People don't quite know how to do it. And if you build that, then you've got kind of a bit of a moat for a little bit of time, I think.
I did it the opposite way with Bear. Is I built something that looks really simple on the outside, but like once it starts scaling, it actually gets pretty complicated um because it's on the open internet and free to use. It just gets hammered by bots and spammers,
Mm.
click farms, etc., etc. So it's like a constant war to keep it sanitary. So that's also a thing to keep in mind. Also, yeah, I'm going to say this, despite not taking my own advice, uh, because I run 2 freemium apps, but charge money. Don't bother with free. Like free users take up the majority of your support time, and
Mm.
they don't contribute anything to the bottom line. Plus, people who pay you money, they tend to be awesome users because they're committed. They've taken out their credit card and typed in those numbers.
Yeah. I mean, there's an element of that in any kind of sale. Is like, sometimes like a higher price is good because it actually like gets buy-in from the person who's using it, right? Because if you're paying like, let's say $1,000 for a piece of software, you're gonna actually implement it. So and we could probably talk about pricing strategies at a later stage. So uh,
Another time.
last quick fire one is like, is there any sort of project that you think should be built right now? Like anything that you're struggling with that
I actually do I have a couple of ideas. I told you about my ideas Trello board, but
yeah.
I'll leave off on what I think is a really good idea for anyone to build. And this is a physical product business, but I think there's a market for it. So I want a thing that looks like an exhaust pipe that I can put on the back of my electric car that blows bubbles. Like when I drive, I want it to blow bubbles.
I think that's doable.
Great, great.